Shelby Foote, the Civil War author, once told me, "The Civil War will determine what kind of country this is going to be." And you know what, Shelby, you're right, because the Civil War definitely defined the region of the South and so much more. And in my opinion, it still defines us. It's the Y'all Show, talk about the South and so much more. And if you're a fellow Civil War buff, I'm preaching to the choir. If you are fairly laissez faire, if you will, on Civil War history or history in general, bear with me a few minutes because I'm going to likely tell you something you've never been taught in school. You may not care, but I think it's a pretty neat story. And as a Southerner, I'm kind of proud of the history of this very small chapter of Civil War history that happened right here in the South. And if you're not familiar with the Civil War in terms of the Navy side of things, the North, right when the war started, launched the Anaconda Plan, and that was an effort to essentially cut off the South from the rest of the world. They had ships of the Union Navy blockading from Texas all the way to essentially Maryland. And in order to get a merchant ship through, or even a Confederate Navy ship through, it took a lot of dedication and guts, and many times they didn't make it through. And so, therefore, the Confederacy had to come up with a plan to try to fight that and also fight against the Union in the inland waters of the South. And so, the Confederate Navy early in the war came up with some really unique and historic things to make a difference. The Confederacy came up with the ironclads, and it was the CSS Virginia that fought the Monitor there in Hampton Roads. That was a key moment early in the Civil War. It was the Confederate Navy that had the CSS Alabama, skippered by Raphael Semmes, and it went around the world and sank Yankee ships and caused a lot of headache to the North. And what a tremendous story it and other Confederate ships had on the high seas of the world. For this struggling infant nation trying to make it, they had a pretty good Navy. And I haven't even brought up the CSS Hunley, the first successful submarine that sank an enemy warship in Charleston Harbor. Those were just some of the parts of the Confederate Navy that I wanted to highlight. Well, to keep the Confederate Navy going, the Confederate government came up with the Confederate States Naval Academy. And I wanted to talk about that here on today's Y'all Show because it's something that even for a buff like me, I had not heard about until recently. The Confederate States Naval Academy was headquartered on the James River just south of Richmond at a place called Drury's Bluff. And there's actually a book about it that I wanted to highlight here for a second called Academy on the James, the Confederate Naval School by Mr. Campbell. As you can see, the book listed there, I don't know how hard that is to pick up, but you can check that out if you'd like and learn about this. The Confederate Naval Academy, as best that I've been able to find out, was very small. It was only in existence, as I said, for a couple of years, right in the heart of the war. But the work they did and the roughly 60 young men that they went through there and taught with about 12 faculty members was pretty amazing. And to do all that, again, when the South was crumbling. One reason that the Confederate States Naval Academy even existed is because there was a ship called the Patrick Henry, and I'll pull it up here because without the ship you wouldn't have had the school. So there's a picture of the CSS Patrick Henry. It was built just before the Civil War started, and it fought in Hampton Roads and sank some ships, but ultimately Hampton Roads and in that area I'm talking about Norfolk and Hampton and some of the other tidewater areas of the Virginia coast, that area ended up having to be given to the Union. They were just too powerful. So these Confederate ships, like the ship here that we're looking at, the Patrick Henry, had to go inland. So it went up the James River to Richmond, and it was there in Richmond that it was sitting there on the side of the river when the Confederate government came up with this idea to start a Confederate States Naval Academy. And so the Confederate government converted this ship, the Patrick Henry, into a training institute. And yes, it did sometimes leave port and go out and fight Union ships. But for the most part, it was a learning lab there in Virginia. And one of the cool things about this ship is this Naval Academy was the leader of it, and that was William Parker here. And that's his picture. I wanted to show you this man who was a native of the Washington, D.C. area, but ended up being the head of the Naval Academy, and he helped train these young men. And in the end, the Confederate States Naval Academy had to be burnt down. The Union forces, when the city of Richmond was falling in 1865, Parker received orders to burn the ship Patrick Henry down to keep it from going to the Union forces. And those young sailors-to-be ended up just essentially surrendering or going back to wherever they came from. I mean, it was a messed up time. Even the United States Naval Academy going on in Annapolis, not far from this, had its own struggles during the war years. I bet you the U.S. Naval Academy probably didn't have that many more sailors going through it as the Confederate States Naval Academy. By the way, the Confederacy did not have a military academy. I guess you could say the Virginia Military Academy and the South Carolina Military Academy and the handful of other schools in each of these states were serving that role, but there was not a so-called CS Military Academy. There was a Confederate States Naval Academy, and Parker was the leader of that. Now, one reason I wanted to talk about Parker is because he is a perfect example of how the Civil War worked. As I said, he was a guy who grew up most of his life in the New York area, but that's his brother we're looking at, if you're seeing us there on screen, Foxhall Parker Jr. And Foxhall Parker Jr. never sided with his Southern roots, and he stayed loyal to the Union. And so he was in the Union Navy during the Civil War, while his brother, William, was leading the Confederate States Naval Academy and also going out fighting in the Civil War. And their father, who was the original the original Foxhall, what a name, Foxhall Parker Sr., had been a very important naval figure in the country prior to the Civil War. He died right before the war started. But again, the Parker brothers, both in the seafaring industry, are an example of brother against brother and how they were on opposing sides of this war. Oddly enough, the Confederate here, William, ended up living out after the war and died in Washington, D.C. I think I was wrong. Both of these guys were actually born in New York City as youngsters. But I think their ancestral home was Virginia. But the CSS Patrick Henry was where the sailors of the Confederate States Navy were based out of, and they learned the basics of going out and fighting. And again, as I said, the Civil War brought about so many modern tactics of that time period of the mid-1800s that ended up being influential when World War I started. The trench warfare, for example, kind of originated in the American Civil War. That was on land, but at sea you had mines that were also part of the Civil War here in America, the submarine, and then the ironclads. The days of the wooden ships ended with the American Civil War, and the Confederate States Navy was a big part of that. And that's why on the Patrick Henry and other ships, they were teaching these young men how to fight modern tactics. And I think they did a good job. Like I said, this was a chapter of the Civil War, even for a guy who's studied this stuff for a long time, I was not all that familiar with. And for all of you who've served in the United States Navy, go look into this stuff, learn more about it, because there's much more about that you can understand. I mean, the Navy, in my opinion, the tradition of the Navy and sort of the expertise you've got to know to be in that service today in 2026 is pretty fascinating. I tip my kepi, or whatever they call it, my dirk. I just recently found out what a dirk is. A dirk is a Civil War weapon, sort of like a small sword that they used in Civil War time on ships. It's what the officers used. It looks like a letter opener, And when they're in close combat, they can't be out running around the ship in a huge sword. So these officers, the ensigns and more, had these little small things called dirks. I've got a friend of mine who collects them. It's pretty cool. And so I tip my dirk to you, all of you who've served in the Navy, but all of your forefathers who've served in our navies of the past, including the Confederate States Navy and the Confederate States Naval Academy. Just a pretty neat little chapter of history. And again, I encourage y'all to go look into this more. There's not a whole lot about it, but yeah, right there just south of Richmond is where this academy was based. And for a country just trying to get started, I thought it was a neat thing that they took the time to do just that. Don't forget, everybody, to like, share, subscribe. It's the Y'all Show. It's talk with an accent on all things Southern, the good, the bad, the history, the modern stuff, the fun. Hopefully you learned something. And fair winds and following seas, including you, Confederate States Navy.